So welcome to the first podcast, and this is where both myself, we've also got Bryn, who's our academic director here.
Good morning.
And Eddie, our senior teacher.
Good morning.
This is where we'll be talking about learning tips and advice on how to learn different things and how to choose academies, how to overcome some of those more typical errors that most Spanish speakers of English tend to have. And this is the first thing that we're here to talk about this morning. So what do you guys think is some of the main problems that Spanish speakers of English tend to have?
Well, one of the common errors is the use of make and do. Often the Spanish speaker confuses do a cake instead of make a cake, do a mistake instead of make a mistake.
It's a very typical one.
Primarily now, because in Spanish now the verb hacer now tends to cover the use of both words, where we generally tend to use do as more of an action or a job, whereas make tends to describe the result of the action.
And there's lots of interference that comes from Spanish, that's often caused by translations, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But, for example, one of the things I often notice, especially when level testing new students here at this school, is the use of the continuous forms instead of the simple forms.
Mm-hmm.
So that idea of I am working versus I work. The difference between the continuous form or progressive form being something that's happening at the moment of speaking, or something in the future if you use a future time marker. I'm working tomorrow from 10 till 12, for example. But when you're talking about your job, it would be I work in a language school, instead of I am working in a language school. I'm working now, but in general, for a personal fact or a general truth, And this happens obviously because in Spanish, they tend to use more progressive tenses to describe what they're doing over a period of time. And it is very different, that continuous versus simple here.
Sure is.
What about you, Brent?
I mean, all interrelated. It's the fundamental problem of translating. There are words which have multiple meanings in one language and only one very specific meaning in another language, or the reverse. We fall into the cognates and the false cognates, things which sound very similar. So the instinct of a non-native speaker is to use the thing that sounds most similar to what they want to convey, and you fall into the most common traps: embarazado, constipado, the classic false cognates. Even probably the most, not as funny, not as entertaining, but the most common is actualmente, actually, having a completely different meaning in Spanish as it does in English. The instinct of a Spanish person is to use actually when they mean currently. And in reverse, when an English person or an English-speaking person tries to speak Spanish, their instinct is to say actually when they mean really, in realidad. It causes big problems, and once you learn about these cognates or these false cognates, it becomes an albatross around your neck. It becomes a millstone. You start worrying about making these mistakes, and immediately confidence becomes eroded. You know there are pitfalls and traps waiting for you at every turn, so you become reticent. Even if you have a vast vocabulary, you tend to stick within your safe boundaries and your safe parameters, which means that your linguistic skills are limited. It means that you cannot express yourself exactly as you wish to, which again leads to a loss of confidence.
And this is an interesting thing, because you're talking there about using the confidence, and something that I think we've all seen as experienced teachers. We've seen this idea of using a safety net of translating. It's something that increasingly we speak to students, and we, students that, particularly those that have taken time away from classes, they fall into this trap of using that safety net of their own native language to translate. Eddie, you have you teach a lot of the lower level learners here. And so you must notice that they tend to rely on translations a lot.
Yes, in the class, as Brent's already said, they tend to focus in the areas where they feel safe. But in the class, if they do have difficulty translating, we can always look for an alternative. That is the key as well. If they don't feel comfortable, well, then we can teach them to use another phrase or expression to convey the same meaning.
We often see in, for example, conversation classes, students, if they get to an unknown word, they'll slip into Spanish and give the word in Spanish. But what do you think the problem is with that?
Well, that's not really learning English, is it, unfortunately?
Yeah.
When you do that, and especially with the technology that's available to people at the moment, you can Google something, you can check something, but that isn't actually learning. When you rely on an additional source, be it technological or be it your own native language, you're not actually learning the language, you're substituting something for something you're comfortable with. If you use a Spanish translation to explain a word, then what you're faced with is really you are not learning to describe the word, you're not learning to use the colour of the vocabulary to convey your message in English, you're taking a shortcut, which of course is convenient and at times can speed up the process, but what it doesn't do is reinforce learning. By describing the word, by creating a context for it, where you can learn its meaning through action, through doing, through the reality of what that word means, you are creating within your mind the framework for developing and using that word functionally, because ultimately English is a tool. English is a way of communicating with people who speak English, and it's also a way of communicating your feelings and your desires. If you slip into a different language, you're not doing that. What you're doing is leaning once again on the crutch of your own language. And there's no criticism attached to that, because it's the natural reaction of most people to find a way to get their message across. But actually the message becomes diluted. Instead of becoming a functional user of the English language, what you become is a functional user of Spanglish. This thing that almost everybody does, mixing languages, and unfortunately from the mixture of languages sometimes comes incoherence. It's problematic.
And I think there's that sort of issue there of slipping into a Spanish word during the conversation, and what that sort of does is it flips the brain back into thinking in Spanish. Eddie, for you, in your classes that you teach, the first sort of 5 to 7 minutes is usually kind of warming them up and changing chip, from English to Spanish. The minute you start using words in your native language again, in this case Spanish, then it takes your brain again another 5 to 6 minutes to actually be able to get focused again in the non-native language that you're learning.
Yeah, true, but that's generally why in the lower level classes and certainly in the higher level classes as well, we tend to focus on a little warmer first to switch the brain over. Something, a revision of a previous activity, a little game or something to switch the person over into English when they walk in the classroom, because obviously many of our students are adults and come straight from work, so have been speaking Spanish for 10 hours. So we always try to flip them, but it is difficult sometimes to maintain that it's an English classroom and we're here to learn English.
Yeah, of course. Why are, particularly in Spain, why do you think Spanish learners of English are so focused on translations? Is it something to do with the culture? Is it something to do with the education system?
That's actually a difficult question to answer, because you can tread into dangerous territory regarding sort of almost cultural imperialism, a desire to maintain attachments to your own language, the idea that your native tongue is somehow superior to another tongue. The reality is probably not unique to Spain, actually. It's probably that people find difficult things difficult. That might sound obvious and redundant, but it's not particularly easy to suddenly start speaking a second language. Human beings are creatures of narrow habit. We fall into our routines and our habits in order to get the best out of life, to find our way more comfortable. And once you become accustomed to something, suddenly switching to another thing is difficult. If you play tennis for a year every day and then someone puts a squash racket in your hand, you will miss the ball no matter how good you are, because you're used to a certain shape and size of tool which you use. And that is why, as Eddie said, that's why we need to flip that switch. That's why we don't just go straight into a complicated lesson. We give people the chance to become accustomed to speaking in that way. And as John says, dropping one Spanish word in that is like throwing a tennis ball into a squash court. It suddenly changes the timbre and the nature of the conversation. Remaining focused on the task in hand is absolutely crucial to develop a natural ability to do it.
So if we, just to finish off, if we could give sort of one piece of advice to a learner of English, what what would that piece of advice be? I'm sure we've all got very different views on this. For me, it would certainly be, look, go into wherever you're learning English and focus on using English. Avoid using Spanish. Follow the guidance of teachers. It's kind of go into learning with an open mind. Don't. Let's not focus on the learning that you've had before, because clearly that's not worked. If you're trying something new, you're trying it because what you've done before hasn't necessarily worked. So my piece of advice would really be go into something with an open mind and follow the instructions from your teacher and the advice.
I mean, that is another crucial point. You trust the professionals. If you're exchanging money for goods or services, you expect those goods and services to be better than what you can produce yourself. The reason why I buy chairs instead of making them is because I'm not a great carpenter. If I wanted to learn another language, let's say I wanted to learn French, I would not rely solely on my own instincts, even though I'm a professional language teacher. I would need a French teacher, somebody familiar with the mores and the specific context of French. If you give somebody money to teach you English, listen to them. There is a strong possibility that they know what they're talking about. And honestly, one of the unfortunate things in the modern world, English has become such a commodity that not every person who is selling that product is a professional. So do your research, make sure you're comfortable in the environment, and make sure you know that the teachers who are teaching you are teachers and not simply speakers of English, because there is a crucial difference there.
So find an expert and trust the experts is the moral of that story.
Yeah.
Eddie, what do you think?
Well, in the classes now, we generally, all our students are different people, and going back to what Bryn said, we will find a way for you, whatever works for you in the class. We will, the first couple of weeks, when you join the class, we'll be listening, observing, but we will find what works for you. Some people it's doing more grammar, some people they like the listening, some people prefer practicing the language. But we try and find a happy medium for everybody. You cannot learn just doing games, you cannot learn just doing grammar, but we try and find a balance so everyone progresses accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And realistic expectations are super important as well. When you walk into a language school, be it this one or be it any other, do not expect to meet your teacher and walk out of that classroom speaking like William Shakespeare.
Well, who speaks like William Shakespeare? That's the first thing.
I can, if required.
Yeah.
Of course, it is a hugely long and time-consuming process. One of the great realities of the world is native speakers of any language do not speak that language perfectly. So the expectation that you will do a 6-month course in the English language and come out utterly proficient in that tongue is nonsensical. What you should be looking for is practical improvement. You should feel confident that every step and every class and every exercise you partake in is adding value to your vernacular, to your lexicon. You should be improving. Do not strive for instant perfection because you will be disappointed. Language teachers can help you to learn a language. They cannot implant it into your brain.
And I think this is also a thing, when we talk about learning English, a lot of people say, oh, I know English. Well, how do you know English? I've been here 20 years and I'm still learning Spanish, and there's also those different, going back to what we said before, there's also those different accents, just among the three of us, I'm Mancunian, we've got Bryn who's a Scouser, and Eddie, you're a Cockney, so Mancunian, Scouser and a Cockney, there's a joke in there somewhere, I'm sure, but we all have our own nuances, our own, little differences, both in the accent, also in some of the phrasal verbs that we use, so that there's not one answer to learning English,
If I went into deep Scouse, both of you would need a dictionary.
So sometimes we do with Eddie.
Eddie could definitely throw me off with some 1970s Ballamisms. And that's one of the realities. Learning a language, the concept of language is such a mercurial thing. It cannot be contained in any simple idea. The fact is that the English language contains words borrowed from every other language, and they become part of the lexicon, they become part of the English language. Some slang is added to the dictionary every year. New words, new portmanteaus are formed all the time. The suggestion that you can learn a language is a little bit of a fool's errand.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, know as natives know, we're in a little bit of a minority now. More non-natives speak English now than native speakers. So it's not unusual to meet someone whose English isn't their first language. If they have an Indian accent, Malaysian accent, Spanish accent, no problem. As long as you speak English with your Spanish accent, no problem. I think we are now moving perhaps to a more international English. No, the experts are talking of this.
Well, let's pick up on that for a minute, because there is this idea of sort of native versus non-native, and I prefer to refer to non-native now as international speakers of English, and there is that sort of idea, isn't there? If you imagine that if you're going to, let's say, international business meetings within a company, for example, and let's say that you're Spanish, you're meeting some French people, there's a couple of Germans there, maybe some Indians, as you mentioned there, and a guy from London. Well, who is actually the non-native? Well, really, it's the guy from London, because everyone else is an international speaker of English. So, there still seems to be a lot of pressure on students to sort of learn native English, have native teachers, and really that's somewhere that's a sort of a way that we should be changing by now, surely, as an industry.
Absolutely. It's a very outdated idea that being born in an English-speaking country somehow gives you an authority over the language as an educator, and it really doesn't. In the international market, as Eddie said, there are more English speakers in China than there are in England. There are more English, I think possibly in the whole world put together, actually. There are a huge number of non-native, or as John says, international speakers of English, using a huge variety of different accents. Within the area of the UK I'm from, 10 miles away from my front door, there are 3 different accents. Accent should not be confused with pronunciation, ever. That's a very, very important thing. You can pronounce the word correctly in 100 different accents. If you make a pronunciation error, if you're the Queen, it's still an error. It doesn't matter what accent you use. One of the things that we are going to encourage through our teaching in our centre and through these podcasts is to give you an idea of how you can speak well, and that the idea of speaking correctly is for the 1950s. Yeah. This is for the BBC, when they excluded... Would Eddie, Bryn and John be on the radio in the 1960s in England? They would not. They would not. We would be cleaning the toilets in the office. We would not be speaking on the radio. Yeah. And it should not be something that you, as learners of the English language, worry about. Your accent is absolutely fine. Let us deal with the pronunciation, and don't you worry about your accent. It's fine.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, I think on that note, we've been chewing the fat for some time now, so I think on that note we need to end there. However, if you would like to know a little bit more about us or our centre, you can get, as Eddie would say, on the old dog and bone and give us a call on 915946491, or go to www.interactive-english-studio.com. So that's it, guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.